Hey everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal events in modern history, the American Revolutionary War. How did a collection of 13 British colonies manage to take on the mightiest empire in the world and forge a new nation? It's a story of courage, conflict, and the birth of an idea that would change everything. So grab your popcorn and let's journey back to the 18th century. Before the first shots were fired, the seeds of revolution were sown over many years. After the expensive 7 Years' War, which you might know as the French and Indian War, Britain was deep in debt. To raise money, Parliament in London decided to tax its American colonies. This didn't sit well with the colonists. They were used to a fair amount of self-governance and believed in a principle that became their rallying cry: no taxation without representation. They argued that since they had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, Parliament had no right to tax them. It started with the Sugar Act in 1764, then the Stamp Act in 1765, which taxed everything from legal documents to playing cards. The colonists protested, boycotted British goods, and formed groups like the Sons of Liberty. Tensions escalated. Remember the Boston Massacre in 1770? British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters, killing 5 people. Then came the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists, disguised as Native Americans, dumped a massive shipment of British tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act. Britain's response was harsh. They passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, which closed the port of Boston and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governing rights. This was the final straw for many. In 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for independence just yet, but they demanded that their rights as Englishmen be respected and organized a coordinated boycott of British goods. The stage was set for a full-blown conflict. And that conflict ignited on April 19, 1775. British troops marched from Boston to Concord, Massachusetts, to seize a colonial weapons cache. They were met by local militiamen in Lexington. Someone fired a shot to this day. No one knows for sure who, and the shot heard round the world, kicked off the American Revolutionary War. The British pushed on to Concord but were constantly ambushed by colonial Minutemen on their march back to Boston. The war had begun. A month later, the Second Continental Congress convened. They established the Continental Army and, in a crucial decision, appointed a Virginian delegate named George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Washington wasn't the most experienced general, but he was charismatic, steadfast, and a symbol of colonial unity. He faced an immense challenge, molding a ragtag group of farmers and merchants into an army capable of facing professional British soldiers, the famous Redcoats. The early years of the war were tough for the Americans. They won a morale-boosting victory at the Battle of Bunker Hill, even though they were ultimately forced to retreat. But they also suffered major defeats. In 1776, the British captured New York City, which they would hold for the entire war. Washington's army was on the run, morale was low, and the revolution seemed on the verge of collapse. But in the midst of this struggle, a powerful idea took hold. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, this remarkable document declared that the 13 colonies were now free and independent states. It laid out the philosophical foundation for the new nation, asserting that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This wasn't just a tax dispute anymore. It was a fight for a new kind of government. Washington knew he needed a victory to restore hope. On Christmas night in 1776, he led his freezing troops across the icy Delaware River for a surprise attack on Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers hired by the British in Trenton, New Jersey. The daring raid was a stunning success, followed by another victory at Princeton a week later. These small battles had a huge impact, reigniting the revolutionary spirit and proving that the Continental Army could win. The turning point of the war came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. American forces, led by Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, surrounded and forced the surrender of an entire British army under General John Burgoyne. This victory was massive. It not only boosted American morale, but also convinced France that the Americans had a real chance of winning. And this is where international politics comes in. France, still bitter about its defeat in the 7 Years' War, had been secretly aiding the Americans. After Saratoga, they officially recognized the United States and formed a military alliance. Spain and the Netherlands later joined the war against Britain as well. Suddenly, what started as a colonial rebellion became a global conflict. French money, weapons, and most importantly, their powerful navy would be absolutely critical to the American victory. While the diplomats were at work, Washington's army endured a brutal winter at Valley Forge in 1777–78. Thousands of soldiers died from disease, starvation, and exposure. It was the lowest point for the Continental Army, but they didn't break. Under the guidance of a Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, the army was drilled and transformed into a more professional fighting force. They emerged from Valley Forge tougher and more disciplined than ever before. The war then shifted south. The British believed there were more loyalists, colonists loyal to the crown in the southern colonies and hoped to rally their support. They captured Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. The fighting in the South was particularly brutal, often pitting neighbor against neighbor in vicious guerrilla warfare. American commanders like Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan used clever tactics to wear down the British forces under General Cornwallis. By 1781, Cornwallis had marched his tired army into Virginia, setting up a base at a port town called Yorktown. He was waiting for resupply and reinforcement from the British Navy, but he was walking into a trap. Washington saw his chance. In a brilliant move, he secretly marched his army south from New York. At the same time, the French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, sailed to the Chesapeake Bay and blocked the British Navy from reaching Yorktown. Cornwallis was trapped. He was surrounded on land by a combined force of American and French troops, and he was cut off from the sea by the French Navy. The siege of Yorktown began. For 3 weeks, the Allied armies bombarded the British positions. Facing overwhelming odds and with no hope of escape, General Cornwallis surrendered his entire army on October 19, 1781. The surrender at Yorktown was the last major battle of the war. While some minor fighting continued, everyone knew the conflict was effectively over. The British public was tired of the long, expensive war, and the government in London began peace negotiations. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The treaty granted the new nation vast territory, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. The war was finally over. The 13 colonies had done the impossible. The American Revolution was more than just a war for independence. It was a revolution in thought, challenging the old order of monarchs and empires. It established a republic, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Of course, the ideals of the revolution weren't extended to everyone. The hypocrisy of fighting for liberty while upholding the institution of slavery would lead to another bloody conflict decades later. And the rights of women and Native Americans were largely ignored. But the legacy of the American Revolution is undeniable. It inspired countless other movements for independence and democracy around the world and created a nation built on the principles of liberty and self-government. It's a complex, messy, and incredible story of how a determined group of people fought for their ideals and changed the course of history forever. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the American Revolution, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. Let me know in the comments what historical event you want us to cover next. See you in the next one.